Hi everyone, so this is your short lecture on the problem of evil. Okay, so we're first going to talk about the problem of evils in general, and then we're going to look at Rowe's argument from evil in the textbook. Okay, so just a quick recap. Up until this point, we looked at arguments for the existence of God. So we looked at the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the ontological argument. The cosmological argument is trying to show that God exists because, Aquinas has a couple arguments, but in general the idea is that God must have existed because that's the only kind of being that could possibly have caused the universe to exist. Okay? God's the thing that set the universe and all the preceding events into motion. All right. The ontological argument is trying to show that from the very concept of God, that God must exist. Because existence is a kind of perfection and God's an all-perfect being. So if God's an all-perfect being, existence is perfection, then God must actually exist. Okay, and there's this whole thing about being in the mind versus outside of reality. If you don't remember what that is, you want to take a look at your notes if you took them, or on the previous video on the ontological argument. The teleological argument is trying to show that because the universe and the world around us has features that make it seem like it's designed, just like we can conclude that a watch must have had an intelligent designer because each of the individual parts of it seems to have a very intentional purpose and it looks designed, as opposed to like a rock that you see washed up on the beach that doesn't seem intelligently designed like a watch. So to you look at the universe and the world, there's lots of very purposeful parts in it. And the idea is that from analogy you can say, just as we can conclude that the watch must have had an intelligent designer, so too must have the world. Okay, and that intelligent designer is God. All right, so one key feature of this God is that this is the big three God. So this God is omnipotent, that means it's all-powerful. It's omniscient, that means it's all-knowing. And it's omnibenevolent, which means it's all good. Okay? And what the problem of evil is going to attempt to do is it's going to try to prove to us that the existence of evil in the world is incompatible with that kind of God. And because evil does exist in the world, it's obvious that there's evils in the world. Okay, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in a second. Because there's evils in the world, an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient God cannot exist. All right. So, there's actually a really nice quote. I tend not to like to talk about quotes in this class. I think there's like a sort of idea that philosophy, people like to quote people a bunch. It's a little bit of a misconception, I think. Quotes usually aren't that important in actual academic philosophy, but nonetheless, this is a really useful quote that I think really sort of encapsulates the idea of the problem of evil, and is actually a standard argument on its own. Okay, this is given by the philosopher named Epicurus. Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher. He was I don't think he's a contemporary of Plato, but he was around that sort of time period. Okay. He had a competing, actually he was after Plato, he had a competing school that tried to follow up from Plato. In any event, he gave this argument, and I have it written on the board. It's a nice little quote here. It's talking about the problem of evil here. So, he starts out by saying, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. And we'll talk through this, let me read it. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both willing and able? Then whence come evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And I think this is really, in a nutshell, what the problem of evil is. Okay, so let's walk through this. So Epicurus asks, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? So in other words, is God willing to try to prevent evil, but he can't do it for whatever reason? Well, he's not omnipotent. In other words, God's not all-powerful. Okay, so if God exists and God wants to prevent evil but he can't, then God's not all-powerful. But because the God we're talking about is an all-powerful God, that can't be right. Okay, so we need to drop this. So it can't be the case that, yeah, God exists, but he can't prevent it. Because then we're not talking about God anymore, we're talking about all-powerful being. Right. Is he able but not willing? So he's omnipotent, but he doesn't want to prevent the evil. Then he's malevolent. Okay, so in other words, if he's malevolent, that means he's evil, really. In other words, he's not omnibenevolent. He's not all good, okay? Because an all good being wouldn't be evil, all right? So if he's able to prevent evil, but he doesn't want to, then he is evil. Is he both willing and able? Then whence come evil, right? So think of it like this. So if God exists, and God's able to prevent evil, and he's willing to prevent evil, then why is there any evil, right? He wants to prevent it, he can do it, so why is it there, right? But of course it actually is there, right? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God, right? So if God is neither able to prevent evil nor willing to prevent evil, so in other words, he's not omnibenevolent and he's not omnipotent, then why should we bother calling him God, right? Because he doesn't have the characteristics of God we're concerned with, all right? So that's the sort of problem of evil in a nutshell, all right? And the idea, right, is that when we're talking about evil here, there's two distinct kinds of evils that the problem of evil talks about. One kind of evil is moral evils, okay? Moral evils are the kind of evils committed by people, all right? So think about murdering innocents, torture, unnecessary suffering, injustices. Those are evils. Those are moral evils that are done by people, okay? Then there's also natural evils, okay? Natural evils are, you would say, evils that come about via nature, right? So think about unnecessary suffering coming from nature. So a hurricane, right? A hurricane, you might think, right? Well, it just does cause a lot of suffering, right? It can also cause lots of deaths. That's a kind of evil, right? But it's not coming from people. People didn't make the hurricanes. The hurricanes just happen naturally, all right? So it's a kind of natural evil. Now, obviously, these evils exist in the world, right? There's injustice all over the world. There's innocent people that die in the world. There's unnecessary suffering in the world, right? I think last I checked, I think like 60,000 children a day or something like that die from famine-related causes. That seems like a totally unnecessary amount of suffering in the world, okay? That's not all the deaths we have every day either, it's just one of them, okay? And to think that it's necessary for kids to die from famine-related causes seems absurd, right? So in any event, I don't think I probably need to convince any of you that moral evil exists in the world. People do evil things. And natural evils exist too, right? Why would you think that a tornado could ever possibly just be like a straight up good thing, right? Tornadoes just cause suffering, all right? Unnecessary suffering at that, right? So natural evils exist, moral evils exist, all right? So in light of those evils, Epicurus is saying, well, look, either we have some God with deficient qualities, now we're not talking about the God we're concerned with anymore, or God can both prevent evil and he's willing to, but then you might wonder, well, then why do we have evil to begin with, right? So the idea is that the problem of evil is forcing the theist to try to explain how evil could possibly exist in the world with this big three God. The problem of evil says it just can't, all right? So that's the sort of general problem of evil. Now, I want to look at Rowe's particular argument, which is a kind of problem of evil argument. I'm not gonna write it down here on the board, but get your textbook. So on page, or just refer back to it, on page 84 and 85, or section 2.3 in your textbook, Rowe's argument for evil is outlined, and you can see the premises and conclusion here. So I want to just talk about the premise and conclusion really briefly, and then I'll talk about the idea of what's going on in the argument. So Rowe says that there's instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby preventing the occurrence of any greater good. An omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any instance of suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby preventing the occurrence of some greater good. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. Okay, so what's going on here, we haven't talked about so far, at least in this video, about evils occurring for a greater good. Okay, so sometimes one way people try to respond to the problem of evil is saying, okay, wait a second, the reason why evils exist in the world, right, so Epicurus' question here of why come evil, if he's both willing and able to prevent evil, one potential answer is, well, no, God prevented all the unnecessary evils, like the ones that have no real benefit, but some theists will argue some evils are needed for another greater good. Okay, and when we look at replies to the argument from evil, we'll see what those goods can be. If you want to preview coming attractions, Some people think the reason why moral evils exist in the world is because of free will, right? And the idea is that, well, look, free will is this really great thing. And it just so happens to be the case that if we have free will, you need to also accept the evils that come from it. But because free will is such a good thing, we need the evils to come as well. Okay, so it's just a part of free will that these moral evils occur, at least. Okay. Some people think that evils are necessary in the world because it makes your soul better. It makes you a better person. It kind of builds your character in a kind of way. We'll talk about the soul-making theodicy in the next video. But there's some greater good that might occur. And you might think just in a sort of general sort of level, right? You can sort of see where there's also cases, so never mind the free will stuff, never mind the soul building stuff, there's lots of cases where we need to engage in evils potentially, or morally regrettable things, I should say, or evils, you could say, for the sake of a greater good, right? So think about war, right? World War II, you might think, was a sort of like necessary evil, right? It was worth stopping Nazism for it. But in the process, lots of innocent people died. And innocent people dying is not a good thing, right? But it was a trade-off that people were willing to make to prevent the world from being a worse place if fascism or Nazism took over, okay? So wars might be like that. On a really, really sort of tiny level, I said earlier that suffering might be kind of a moral evil, but there's plenty of cases where we voluntarily engage in suffering for some greater good, right? So working out, right? A lot of people sort of suffer from that. They might be in pain. They might be really exhausted. It might be sort of, it could be psychologically taxing in some ways for some people, okay? So they're suffering in a way. But there's a trade-off. The trade-off is that while you suffer sort of in the short term, in the long term, you get some health benefits, right? Or think about when we give children shots or vaccines, right? They're suffering in a way because they're crying. They don't like things being put in their body. They don't like needles being stabbed in their arm, right? But it's a trade-off because it's better than them getting polio, right? So it's a necessary, maybe you don't want to say it's an evil, but the suffering is for a good cause, right? Namely, it's to prevent polio, it's to prevent Nazism from spreading, it's to make you healthier, whatever. Okay, so if moral evil, if suffering is a kind of moral evil, sometimes we actually voluntarily engage in it for some greater good. Okay, so that's a little side note about why some evils might be necessary, because there's some greater benefits that we need that necessarily brings evil along with it, like free will and so on. Okay. All right, so again, those are the premises I just talked about. Again, they're in the textbook right here on page 84. Okay, so what does Rowe do here? Well, the idea basically is that, let's look at 2 here. An omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without ever preventing the occurrence of some greater good. So, what that premise is saying, again, is like, look, maybe we can allow some sorts of evils to occur. He's giving the theist that. He's saying, well, let some occur because maybe there's some greater good. But the problem with that is that that premise actually seems false, because he's going to say that there are cases of intense suffering that an omnipotent God could prevent where there is no greater good or benefit coming from that suffering. And the example he gives is the fawn suffering in the forest, right? So the idea is that suppose that there's a fawn in the forest and the forest ends up catching on fire and a tree falls on the fawn and kills it, okay? And then it dies a slow, painful death, all right? So there's a fawn suffering intensely. Suffering is a kind of evil. Okay, question. What was the greater good needed from that fawn suffering? Why did that fawn need to suffer and go through all that pain? For what good exactly? Rowe's gonna say there is no further good needed, right? Or excuse me, there is no further good to come from that, all right? Maybe it's good that the forest was like naturally put on fire because then like it burns the forest floor and foliage and like whatever. Maybe it's like part of the natural cycle or whatever, okay? But you might think But couldn't have God made it so that the forests don't need to catch on fire like that, and he could just design the forest in a different kind of way? Or could he have made it so that the fawn like left the forest at the proper time, or like migrated or moved away from the tree at the last second? Like, could God have done that? Yeah, God could have done that. What possible reason he's gonna say? What greater good comes from the fawn dying? Is it so like the wolves can eat later? Is that a greater good than the fawn living? It's not obvious, right? Okay, so basically, it just seems like this creature is suffering for no good reason, all right? It's not doing anything by suffering, okay? It's not getting any better. Its character isn't getting built. It's just dying, and then that's it, okay? So it seems like a totally unnecessary evil, all right? And the idea is that because of those sorts of unnecessary evils, Rowe's going to say, well, in that case, we do have instances, not just of the fawn, but you can think of other sorts of instances too, of seemingly unnecessary suffering, right? You might think, and Rowe doesn't talk about this in particular, but you might think there's all sorts of other cases besides fawns dying, right? You might think that children dying from easily preventable illnesses in poverty-stricken countries who die slow, painful deaths, right? That seems totally unnecessary. What's the reason to have a child be born into the world just to shortly die thereafter and be in intense pain? Just seems to be no reason at all for that, right? No one's benefiting from this, okay? So, that's the idea. Because there's evils like that in the world, and God could prevent them, and there's no good reason for them to be occurring, it seems like, in fact, either God can't prevent them, in which case God doesn't exist, right? We're not talking about an omnipotent God anymore, all right? Or he could prevent it, but he doesn't, so then he's not all good, and then we're talking about God again. So no matter what, you're ending up talking about a God who's not omnipotent or omnibenevolent, all right? So, that is the argument from evil.